very much for inviting me, Carolyn. So just to clarify, a lot of those 40 things are very small things, like book reviews and things. So just to set the expectations at the right level. More expectations management. Hopefully, if you're worried about philosophy talks, am I going to know anything about this? This is a very interdisciplinary talk, and so we're talking about happiness. Hopefully you will have at least some experience with happiness. So we should be able to connect to this. So I've been studying happiness from an interdisciplinary perspective: philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, economics, although I won't know as much about neuroscience as you guys, but a little bit. For about 9 or 10 years, and I still find it very interesting. I get asked all the time, so has it made you happier studying happiness? And I'm not really sure that it has, actually, but it's certainly very interesting and very fun, and I do enjoy doing it. And I thought, well, what about philosophers themselves? Does studying philosophy make people happy? And then I thought about what I need to know to be able to answer that question. And because I'm interested in well-being in general, and lots of my colleagues from outside of philosophy do surveys, I thought I might be able to get in on this. And one of my colleagues and friends, Aaron Jardin, was organising a very large international study called the International Wellbeing Study, nice clear name, and that has thousands of people from all around the world in 16 or more languages completing this very long survey about well-being. And he suggested that I set up a cohort of philosophers. He did an undergrad in philosophy before he became a positive psychologist. And so I thought, sure, that'd be interesting. So I got some philosophers to answer the survey as well, using the philosophy email list, the international ones. I got a few emails back saying, why did you make us do that? The survey was nearly half an hour long, and they weren't very happy with me by the end of the survey. But still, over 100 philosophers responded, grad students and professional philosophers of all levels. And then I realised I had this great data sitting there, and it was the first step. But it wasn't enough to answer the question of whether philosophy makes us happier. And so I did a couple of extra studies. And so this is a summary, and it's a very underbaked summary of all that research. One of the reasons it's underbaked is I recently moved from New Zealand, and I left all the data on a computer, on the desktop of a computer. So I took all my information that I needed apart from the things on the desktop. I left the original data files there. So I'm trying to get reacquainted with them. There's a couple of places where I would like the analysis to be better than it is. So I apologise in advance for that. So these are preliminary results. But I have done some analysis. And I'm just going to do a little bit of background, because apparently you don't get a lot of talks from philosophers, so it's a chance to get a little bit of philosophical theory. And so I just want to really talk about two concepts: happiness and well-being. And though they're often used interchangeably, the idea for happiness really depends on which discipline you're coming from, but we can call it, in psychology, it's feeling good and not feeling bad and being satisfied with your life. It's really taken to be a combination of those things. And philosophy, it's in dispute, as you might imagine, between feeling good and not feeling bad, or being satisfied with your life, not pushing the things together. And then we have well-being. So well-being, what I mean by that is, it's the good life for the one living it, or the prudential good life. What makes my life go well for me? What makes everyone's lives go well for them? Now, happiness might be the one and only thing for well-being, but maybe there are other things as well. And lots of philosophers think there are other things as well. I really like happiness, and I think happiness can go a long way to filling well-being. There's a lot of disagreement about that. And so, looking at well-being, there are three main groups of theories to explain what well-being is. And the way these theories work is they boil down the things that are good for us into the things that have intrinsic value for us, the ultimate sources of value in our lives. So finding a dollar bill on the sidewalk, well, that's good for me. Seeing my children smile at me, that's good for me. Having a pleasant dream might be good for me. thinking I'm going to get an article published might be good for me. Why are those things good for me? In what way are they good for me? So there's several different tests. One is the why test. Why is that good? Why is that good? Why is that good? Because money by itself doesn't do much. It's what we do with it. It's a key example. And when we get to the end of asking why, maybe there's something, well, it's just good in and of itself. And so pleasure is usually the key example for that. Pleasure feels good. Why is feeling good for you? It's a very hard question to answer because it feels good. Well, feeling good feels good. Not getting very far. So it kind of bottoms out there. And so we think, well, that's a good indication. As long as we agree that feeling good is good for us, then it's an indication that that has intrinsic value. And these different theories of what well-being is, they're trying to get at that. They're trying to get at what are the things that have intrinsic value? The things that, when it really comes down to it, make our lives go well for us. Three main groups of theories. One is hedonistic theories, or just theories about pleasure and not pain. So the good life is a life full of pleasure and without very much pain in it. And then there are satisfaction theories, desire satisfaction theories. You get what you want. And in often cases it's, I'm pleased with my life the way it is. I have these desires about my life, I want my life to be a certain way, and the actual circumstances of my life match up very well to my desires about my life. So effectively, having the life you want or getting what you want is the intrinsic value for that theory. And then there are objective list theories, which are, these are the things. Maybe it's truth, friendship and happiness, or maybe it's connection with God, or everyone writes their own lists, and then they have to argue, why are these things intrinsically valuable? And they have to try and defend themselves from someone saying, yeah, but that makes you happy, yeah, but that gives you pleasure, and so on. So they're the three main groups. And you may have heard of flourishing theories as well, which I think are really it's an objective list kind of theory, but it's got this naturalistic explanation for why things go on the list. Flourishing, you're being all you can be. So that's very popular in positive psychology. Imagine a flower that's kind of droopy and wilting and not very colourful. The bees are just passing it by. That flower is not flourishing. But if it's bright, it's perky, the bees are stopping by every chance they get, it's flourishing. It's doing all it can do as a flower. Now imagine the human equivalent of that. I'm being all I can be as a human. That's me flourishing. But what does that mean specifically? Well, what are the special characteristics of being a human? We start to list those things down and, I see, I'm just writing a list of these key things. Okay, so that's why the flourishing accounts, I think, are very much like objective list accounts with just naturalistic explanation. So there are these broad ways of understanding these terms. I'm mainly going to be talking about happiness because that's what I have the data on. I also have quite a bit of data on well-being, and one slide will allude to that. My key question is just about happiness. But what we think about this, what we think about my results, is going to depend a lot on what you think about well-being itself and the place of happiness in well-being. So just quickly recap. Happiness could be all of well-being. What makes your life go well? Being happy. What about doing this other thing? Well, it doesn't make you happy? No. Well, it doesn't matter. That's one kind of extreme version of how the two go together. And the other one, the other extreme is happiness doesn't matter. Happiness has no, it's just a little fluffy trifle on the side. It's nothing important for your life. And of course, then we have in-between views. So that's kind of the theoretical backdrop for this. And my personal view, like I said, I like happiness, maybe more than most philosophers, maybe about the same as most normal people. I'm not really sure about that. And so I'm kind of coming at it a bit from that angle. So I'm happy to discuss that aspect of it as well. But okay, onto the study. So there are three key questions that I felt like I needed to answer to be able to satisfy myself in regards to this issue. One, are philosophers happy? A basic question. And then, are philosophers happier than non-philosophers? And then, is it philosophy that's making philosophers happier? Or is it that philosophy attracts happy people at the front end? Something like that. So I just want you to think about it a moment for yourself, what you think the answers to these questions are, just for a moment. there will not be a quiz afterwards. And I've passed around a survey. So this survey is the survey that I used in the 2 smaller experiments. If you want to, you can fill in that survey. I don't mind if you don't fill it in. Also, it's useful because it has the wording of the question. So when we're looking at the data, if you want to know more, then you can see exactly how the question was asked if you have a question about that. So feel free in the boring moments of the talk to fill that in. There's something to do. You can draw faces in the circles as well. That's something nice. And just be aware though, if you do fill it in, you might be kind of comparing yourself against the results that I show, which is not always fun. So just bear that in mind. One more thing is the results I'm going to show, I've scaled everything. So everything I'm putting up on the slides will be on a 0 to 10 scale. Whereas you can see from the questionnaire, they don't start out like that. So, why should we care? Well, I've heard there's one philosophy graduate student in the room who might think about this very seriously. And with the rest of you, you might be able to you might care because it's funny looking at philosophers and what happens to them is a kind of amusing thing to do. And there are a few professional philosophers in the room. For them, I call it a triad of tension you might have to deal with later on, so look out for that. For the one graduate student, this is important because if philosophy makes you happy, great, let's pursue it with more vigour. But if it doesn't, then should we pursue it? And that will go back to the question of well-being and where happiness sits within well-being. So 3 data sets that I used for this research. So one, I'm actually kind of listing them not in the order that I conducted them, but in 2003 I did a small survey using the form that you've got there, and it was on an introductory level ethics class. There were 33 philosophy majors, and the rest were not philosophy majors. So those 33 philosophy majors, in New Zealand you declare your major straight away, and we don't do general education, you just kind of get into doing stuff and then out the other end 3 years later and get a job. It's a bit different. So those 33 philosophy majors in this introductory course, they're my philosophical novices. We're going to have 3 groups of philosophers at different life stages. These are my novices. And the comparison group for them are these other students who are doing an undergraduate ethics course still, so they're still taking a philosophy course, but they are not majors. And that means it's probably their first philosophy course, and it may be their only philosophy course. For the novices, it's probably their second philosophy course. But for some of them, they'll have equal philosophy experience. Maybe some from both groups will have had one philosophy course. But their intentions, at least, are different, separated by their major. And I asked them those questions that you have there at the start of the course. And then that was semester 2, and then after that, in the summer semester, remember summers at the different, in New Zealand, summer, Now this was a very small experiment, so I had my own class on happiness, my own philosophy class on happiness, and I tested the students at the start and at the end, thinking I can also see if my course made them happier. But then I thought, well, that doesn't really work. I need to control for that if I'm going to have any idea if I'm really doing anything. And there was another course, a history course, running at exactly the same time, a condensed summer course with the same kind of assessment, running over the same dates, similar size. They were both upper level undergraduate courses. Great, so I had this perfect experiment that I could run the surveys in both classes. But they weren't very large classes, as you can see there. And that 29 plus 20, 29 were philosophy majors, and 20 were not philosophy majors in my happiness course. And the one, it's kind of interesting, maybe I can talk about this more later, but those 20 non-philosophers, I later found out, have a very interesting psychological profile as assessed by my surveys, which in a nutshell was that they were unhappy people who really thought that the happiness could change. And so they were taking my courses as self-help courses, how I understood it. whereas the philosophy majors didn't seem to be in that boat. And I have it like that because the results are statistically significant if I include those others, and they're not if I don't. And I think it's best not to include them in actual fact. So a lot of my results aren't statistically significant, but the pattern is the same. But I can answer more questions about that later if I need to. And I asked them exactly the same questions. And also a question about if they thought the course made them happier as well. So this is not the main point of this talk, but did my course make them happier? Very slightly compared to the other course, but not statistically significantly at all. And so really I don't know. But I wasn't trying to make them happier either. That wasn't the point of the course. I kept trying to say that. And they were like, whatever, tell us how to be happy. And then there was a large international online survey that I've already mentioned. That actually occurred in 2011, and maybe some of the responses in 2012 coming through that. And there are over 100, but I only selected the English language ones. And they're half split between graduate students and all levels of professor. So these are the professional philosophers. So we have our novices, our apprentices or our beginners, and our experts. So this group will have had one philosophy course on average. This group will have had 2 to 6 philosophy courses, and these guys have had graduate study and maybe years and years and years and years and years of employment as a philosopher. There's quite a range in this group. There are loads of questions in that survey. Like I said, it took nearly half an hour. And there were thousands of respondents, but I did my analysis I randomly selected 96 from the English language version out of the thousands and did my comparison that way, just to make sure I wasn't getting kind of all excited about significant results about a tiny, tiny difference. So, on to the first question. Are philosophers happy? How might I find this out? I could just go and ask some philosophers. The problem is, if you ask someone, oh, are you happy? Then we're culturally conditioned to say, yeah, how's it going? Good. It's the same in New Zealand as it is here. And there are people who don't say good. There's people who say, oh, not so good actually. And we're like, oh. Sorry, got to go. It's just saying hello. And so when you just ask people this question, you're unlikely to get a very useful answer. And even if you ask a philosopher, when a philosopher asks a philosopher a question, there's this implication often that you'll think about it deeply, because that's what we do. So if you ask a philosopher, are you happy? And they say, yeah. Because it's so instinctual and yet they still want to think about it. But when they start going like that, they're looking up and they're remembering and they're imagining, and they're just like, okay, I'm not really sure that I can trust what you're going to say. And of course, if they're grading, they'll just say, no, I'm not happy, and explain it that way. What about putting them in brain scanners? Well, I would love to have had the budget to do that, but I also think it's not going to be very useful for a long, long time at least, until we learn more about the neuroscience of happiness, which I am very interested in. But as for now, we're doing the different methods, and the best correlations with self-report happiness surveys is about 0.3. And even though, 0.3 is not a great correlation when you're trying to find 2 measures of the same thing, rather than just related things. And the fact that the survey results are the test, they're the standard by which the brain scans are being assessed by. Okay, so brain scans aren't going to be very useful just yet. But if we know more about exactly what the different neurotransmitters do and so on, I think there's a future there. We're just not there yet. And certainly, I don't have the money to do that. So we can use psychological measures. And so the psychologists that I talked to are a bit annoyed about how I did this, because I just picked certain questions that I thought were good questions about happiness. And there's measured like 20 item measures, and I'm like, I'm going to have this question and this question. And they're like, no, you're going to get results that aren't robust. It's not a valid procedure. You need to run your factor analysis and all these things to work out what you're doing works. And I so there's some value to that, but I really disagree that it's a weakness of my study, and I'm happy to take questions about this. And one of the things is, when I've worked with psychologists, and they say, well, look, here's what the data says, we should group these different questions for this concept, or the construct of this concept. I'm like, but that question isn't really talking about that. It's talking about something else. And now, yeah, but it fits in. The data says that it goes well. And I find that I lose those arguments with them. So all I did is I just picked out items that are really about happiness, because they say happiness in the question, for example, and then I got a bunch of those from different measures. So you might think that's less robust, and I haven't done any kind of checks to see how well the alpha values really are. I haven't done that, but they seem like they're good questions about happiness to me, and we can take them individually or we can combine them. And for most of the analysis, I have them individually anyway. And I'm doing these surveys in classes, and I didn't want to take up half an hour of class asking the full 20-item versions of several different questionnaires that included questions that I thought were about a different concept. Feel better about getting that off my chest. So I'm going to be showing a lot of these different graphs. Just a reminder, everything's scaled from 0 to 10, but sometimes I've truncated the axis just to kind of make my results look bigger and more interesting, but also maybe to make space down the bottom. But also at the end, I've got a slide where I can tell you which results are statistically significant, so you can see that for yourself. But so, are philosophers happy? Yeah, they are pretty happy. If we assume that being happy means getting over halfway on the surveys, getting over the halfway point. If halfway is neutral and below halfway is unhappy, then these are the three different groups. We'll be seeing these a lot. So they're my novices, and my intermediates, and my professionals, and they're all above the line, apart from on this one. But this question is percentage of the time happy. So as you can see, this is question 3, and it's percentage of the time happy and neutral and unhappy. And so to get over 50% on that would be pretty strong. I think maybe as a rule of thumb, you want your happy percentage to be bigger than your unhappy percentage, to say, following the same kind of 50-50 rule for the other ones. So there's some very rough evidence that philosophers are happy. Well, also a couple of other questions that are relevant. Are they satisfied with their lives? Yep, pretty much satisfied with their lives, over halfway at least. And remember, satisfaction with life, that's one of the main understandings of what happiness means. These other questions, if you look, they ask you, like, how often did you feel happy? Or how happy are you? In general, I consider myself not a very happy person or a very happy person. So the happiness one, to me, talk about happiness. So I've separated off satisfaction with life. Frequency of feeling last week. I'm as good as other people, kind of a self-esteem kind of question. It's actually taken out of the Centre the Epidemiological Studies measure of depression. But anyway, I'm using it as a measure of self-esteem, but you can see the exact wording of the question. And yep, over half again, so that's kind of promising. Also, are we optimistic? 3 very different questions about optimism, different things we can be optimistic about. In the happiness studies, optimism and extroversion are actually seen as very important forces in whether or not you're going to be happy, because they have a big effect over your behaviour, and your behaviour, of course, will affect what outcomes you get in the world. And for these 3 different optimism measures, scoring above half again. So this is the least interesting of the 3 questions. A little overview, there's a couple extra things that I want to point out. Importance of happiness. This is philosophers rating how important they think happiness is in life. So this gets at the how much space does happiness take up in well-being? That question from the start. And so philosophers think happiness is pretty important. And this one, can happiness be changed? So philosophers think happiness cannot be changed. So if its happiness can be changed, we'd see it kind of higher up. So just remember that happiness cannot be changed. So those 2 beliefs about happiness, about the importance of happiness and what we can do with happiness, we want to remember those for later on when we try and solve any riddles that come up like this. So, are philosophers happy? Yes, but they're not very happy. They're not ecstatic or jumping for joy happy. They're a bit happy. Okay, that probably fits what you might have guessed. So let's move on to a more interesting question. Are philosophers happier than non-philosophers? We start to get a bit more interest. And hopefully you thought about what your answer was to this question. And now we could go through it. Imagine asking, we could ask someone. I could say, Carol, are you happier than the non-philosophers around? So the person who makes your coffee, are you happier than them? Tricky question to answer, right? So maybe we should do some kind of surveys or something instead. So we're using exactly these measures again, and more measures as well for the big online test. And I did using a t-test to compare means with Levine's test for equality of variance, just to make sure that I was doing the right kind of analysis. And looking at it very roughly, I'm going to look at it more specifically as we go through. This is percentage of the time philosophers report being happy. These are the philosophers, and they're the non-philosophers. And the non-philosophers are just, they're all above where the philosophers are at. That's a very rough way of looking at it. Now this is how often they report being unhappy, because this is relevant as well. And there's a bit less difference. These are the philosophers again, and the professional philosophers winning that race, the unhappiness race. Especially compared to the normal people. So who are those people? They're just people who took this survey from all around the world who are very, very unlikely to be philosophers. But they could be anything else. But they must be above 16 years of age. And on average, they're about the same age as the philosophers taking the survey. Still pretty rough though. Now, there's lots of graphs like this as well. So this is percentage of the time they're happy, and here I'm comparing the little comparison groups within each study. So this is the intro ethics course, and the first line is always the philosopher group, and the second line is a non-philosopher group. And what you can see is that for all of these, apart from the one that's circled, the non-philosophers do better than the philosophers. See, for every single one. And this is percentage of time happy, frequency of feeling that I'm happy last week, belief that I'm a happy person, frequency of feeling I'm enjoying life. My happiness compared to my peers is a slightly different question, and when I make a condensed measure of happiness, I don't put that in, because it's more than just am I happy, it's got a judgment about other people. But I still think it's an interesting question, because it gets at the kind of biases that might be going on, which we might talk about later. And then percentage of the time not unhappy. But that was percentage of time happy that I've reversed. And whoa, the philosophers win one of all of these, and only just, and not statistically significantly. And that's the very, very novice philosophers, the philosophy majors who haven't actually taken more than one philosophy course. Not looking so good so far for the philosophers. So here I've just squashed those happiness measures together and averaged those. And the same for the optimism, the 3 different optimism measures, I just squashed those together. Quite unscientifically, but the point is just to get enough information on the page across without making every graph like that last one. And so here we start, this is intro level, so novices, apprentices or intermediates, and then professionals. And you can see the philosopher bar always comes first again. And we can see that the philosophers do worse in all 3 of the studies. Apart from this little one here, so the self-esteem, effectively, of those new philosophers is the only thing that philosophers don't lose on. So optimism as well. Optimism has a very similar pattern to happiness, you can see. The philosophers do worse. And so not happiness, but satisfaction with life. Philosophers still doing worse, but this is relevant later. A little uptick. But it's a very small, so it's not the kind of thing to write home about, but at least maybe it's a glimmer of hope that we're going to talk about later. So notice that philosophers' views on happiness change. Their levels of their the views of happiness change and the other people's views of happiness stay pretty similar. So philosophers change their views of happiness if the data is anything to go by, and like I say, it's pretty preliminary, but if it's right, then philosophers change their views of happiness and normal people don't change their views of happiness so much. So, see the importance of happiness. Philosophers, which is the first column, here, here and here, they have quite a big change in how important they think happiness is. Of course, that could be reactive to their loss of happiness. We'll talk about that later. And then the view that happiness cannot be changed might even start increasing. They're like, oh, I can't even change my happiness anyway. But again, it's not, those differences aren't so big. The pattern's not so clear. So that's another clue about what might be coming for these riddles. So are philosophers happier than non-philosophers? No, they're not. They're less happy. They're less happy, they're less optimistic. They seem to be doing worse on lots of measures of well-being. And there's another slide I can, somewhere in here later, and there's a whole bunch of other measures from just the one big online study, a whole bunch of other positive psychology measures, and philosophers do worse on every single one, or some are not significant, but they do, on all the ones that are significant, statistically significantly different from the difference in means, philosophers do worse on every single one. Nice. So if that's true, does practicing philosophy make people happier? Well, that's a bit unlikely. So we need to change the question, does practicing philosophy make people unhappier? And then, in order to answer that, we've got to make sure we check, are unhappy people attracted to philosophy? Because that might be a big part of it. And this might be part of the answer going through in a slightly adjusted way. So we can compare the happiness reports from the novice philosophers with their non-philosophy contemporaries to see if unhappy people are attracted to philosophy. So if we can see that when we compare the novice philosophers with their non-philosopher contemporaries, if there's already a big difference, then we're like, oh, unhappy people are being drawn to philosophy. Okay. So we'll check that out. There's a bit of a problem that I want to flag for this exact comparison. It would have been better to compare first year philosophy majors in a philosophy course with first year history majors in a history course or something like that. So maybe we won't expect to see such a big difference. But like I say, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, lots of people take a philosophy course. And so there's still something in this comparison. And what we see is the differences are very small. The philosophy majors do a bit worse, or they report, doing a bit worse on these measures. This is the only one that's statistically significant, only this difference here. And that's satisfaction with life, which remember is one of the ways to understand what happiness means, satisfaction with life. So all the rest are small differences. And this one, the philosophers do better. That's that self-esteem question, but it's not statistically significant. It's a very small difference. Like I've truncated the scale of the axis a bit here. So it seems like that's not really the answer. Or if it is the answer, it's not doing a whole lot of work. So maybe a little bit, maybe unhappy people are attracted to philosophy a little bit. But there's got to be more to it, because the differences in the final study, professional philosophers against non-philosophers, there's a huge difference in a lot of those measures. So, does practicing philosophy make people unhappier? We can just ask the experienced philosophers, has your experience with philosophy made you less happy? And they say, no, I love it, it's great. I wouldn't still be doing it if it didn't make me happy. Or they say, well, happiness doesn't matter. I like to be grumpy. It's the proper state of being for a decent human being. So that's not really going to work very well. So again, we want to compare the reports of philosophers at the different life stages is one way to do it. So we compare the novice philosophers with the intermediate philosophers with the professional philosophers. And the problem here is the context that I'm assessing them in are changing. And so we're not really holding the background conditions very consistent. So if I do see changes between these different groups, I really can't learn a lot from it, because it could be that it was a sunny day where I did one study, or in happiness studies they have assessed that the weather does affect how you report on how satisfied you are with your whole life. There's a statistically significant difference based on whether or not it's raining or it's sunny. There's a statistically significant difference in how you report being satisfied with your whole life if you find a dime before you take the survey. So these judgments can be, they can't be swung, from one pole to the other by any old thing, but they can be bumped to the extent where my results would be useless. So this is just one step into trying to assess this difference. And also, there are known effects of age and income and those other variables on happiness. And novice philosophers are not a very rich bunch. Professional philosophers aren't exactly loaded either, but there's still a difference in age and a difference in wealth and other things. So, and this doesn't control for this kind of analysis. So there's some problems, nonetheless. So here's an example. So this is the study of the first year, the introductory ethics course here, and this is the special happiness course that I did compared to the history course over summer. And maybe there's a structural difference there. See how both samples in the second study went down, and this is about percentage of the time they feel happy. Well, we know that the students here take summer courses, and we don't know that about these guys, and we assume statistically that most of them don't take summer courses. Well, maybe it's the case that taking summer courses means you spend less of your time being happy. I mean, maybe that's true. If that is true, then when we look at this difference, it doesn't really mean as much. We can't draw as strong conclusions from it. So just to bear that in mind. And there's another way to do it as well. We can take the novice group and the intermediate group and the professional group and take the difference between each of those groups and then compare those differences. And I think that's a slightly stronger way to do it, but that's not without its problems either. And the main problem with that is, for that to work really well, the controls have to be equivalent, the same kind of controls for each individual study. And the control groups aren't set up in exactly the same way. And so this isn't perfect either. But here's a little thing I'm going to try and get away with. 2 imperfect ways of doing it equals 1 really good way of doing it. Hopefully you would fully accept that. So again, let's look at the data. So this is now just comparing the philosophers at their different life stages going through. So the novices, intermediate, and professionals now. And we can see happiness, they get worse. And over here, self-esteem gets worse. Optimism gets worse. Satisfaction with life gets better, or certainly doesn't have the same obvious relationship as the other ones. Bearing in mind that the middle column here, the intermediate group, is always going to have more fluctuation because it has quite it's the smallest sample size of all of them. So I'm always a bit wary of the middle one. So anyway, satisfaction, glimmer of hope, like I said. But happiness, and that's what the question is about, as defined by the person themselves, they're using their own definition of happiness when they fill out a question that has happiness, the word in the question. It's pretty clearly going down, but also note that truncated the scale quite a bit. What about these other things? What about their beliefs? Now, importance of happiness, I pointed this out before. Remember, that really drops down. Yeah, we get less happy, if we care about happiness less. And a slight change in this. Percentage of time not unhappy. This also means we spend more time being unhappy as we progress in the profession. And happiness compared to peers. So it doesn't quite fit, but remember again, this involves a judgment about your own happiness and a judgment about other people's happiness. And lots of the philosophers I know, they don't really have friends as such. So their peers are probably going to be their colleagues, who they're definitely not friends with in most cases. But they might be aware of this kind of thing we're kind of stumbling across, which is that philosophers aren't very happy. So when you're a professional philosopher, maybe you do think you're happy compared to your peers because they all seem very unhappy. And maybe, but let's see. So now here's an attempt to show a whole lot on one. I've got a simpler version of this, so for the next slide, but I just want to introduce all the different elements. And these little, they're actually explosions apparently, they are to indicate that it's a statistically significant difference. And I can just summarize it for you, the differences. This is difference between, so study 1, study 2, study 3. So differences between the philosophers and the non-philosophers in each study. And the explosions mean they're statistically significant differences. For the big study, the 96 versus 96, the International Professional Philosophers study, they're just about all significant. There's only a few that aren't. For the middle study, none are significant, because remember I ejected all these people who came for the self-help course. But if I left them in, then most of them are significant. And then for the study of the novice philosophers, there's only one significant result, which is the satisfaction with life result. And that's, how does this work with the science? So these are the different individual questions. And this here means it's a negative difference, which you can read as the philosophers are doing worse than their contemporaries, or the group that I'm comparing them against. So occasionally they do better. And this, they do better, but that's just their belief about whether or not happiness cannot be changed. So they're more likely to think that happiness cannot be changed. There's differences between the groups, again. And so for each little set of bars, the bottom one are the novices, and the top one are the professionals. And you can see here that when we compare the differences tend to increase. Not uniformly, but they do tend to increase. These are the measures of happiness down the bottom, and satisfaction with life there. So this is an important difference. So when we were looking at the absolute levels, it was a bit unclear, but now we're looking at the relative differences, and we can see that the professional philosophers, what does that mean? They've nearly hit the zero. They've nearly caught up with normal people on satisfaction with life. And that's the self-esteem one there, where the novices do okay at that, but so small, not significant. And importance of happiness, this very noticeable change. Okay, so I have the data on the individual questions there, but it's a bit easier to read this version where I've condensed the happiness down and the optimism down, so you can see what's going on a little bit better. And in a nutshell, happiness, optimism, and importance of happiness, they all have a clear kind of strong relationship, I think. But satisfaction with life doesn't. So that's very interesting. So for those ones, so for happiness and for optimism and the importance of happiness, that's both an absolute and a relative difference that increases with the time you're in the profession. Absolute and relative. Satisfaction is a bit different. And effectively we see the difference between the groups, so the relative difference decreases, but absolutely it doesn't really change very much over time. So the difference we're seeing is more like a difference in other people than a difference in the philosophers. But so it's kind of a weak result. So how can we start thinking about this? Well, maybe we're just more realistic as philosophers. If we have a self-serving bias, or we just tend to interpret things that, rose-tinted glasses, about 10% better than they are, including ourselves. I'm 10% more moral, 10% better driving than I really am, all those kinds of things. Well, that might explain why philosophers scoring roughly 10% different from non-philosophers are just more realistic about our own happiness and about a whole bunch of things, about how good the future's going to be for us. We're just so smart that we understand what's really going on with us and with the world. It's one kind of potential way to understand this. We're going to go back to that riddle in a moment. Emergency alert?
Amber alert, yeah.
Oh, is that not matter if it's amber?
There's nothing we're going to do about it right now.
Okay. So if I go and tell them philosophers aren't very happy, is that going to... So, does practicing philosophy make people unhappier? Probably, or maybe possibly. There's not really enough evidence to say. But maybe it depends on what we do. There's more things we can do to think about this. So here's the triad of tension for you professional philosophers and for myself in the room. So these are three propositions that you believe to be true, I assume, but they don't really go very well together. But of course, so the trick is you just think one of them's actually not true to try and get out of this triad of tension. First of all, I'm smart, so I make effective prudential decisions. I make decisions that are good for me because I'm really smart. Number two, happiness is important. We actually have some evidence for that from the surveys. Philosophers think happiness is important. And number three, I chose something that made me less happy. I chose philosophy, and at least at a glance, the evidence seems to show philosophy makes you less happy compared to what you could have been doing, which is whatever the non-philosophers were doing in the big international survey. They could have been making the coffee, or who knows what they were doing. Okay, so how can we resolve this? You might think, I am super smart, but I'm just not very smart in the area of prudential decision making. My smartness lies in metaphysics and epistemology only, or something like that. So you might say something like that and not feel so bad. You might say, happiness isn't important. Remember I said well-being and happiness. And maybe well-being is truth and friendship and knowledge, and happiness makes up about this much of it, or nothing at all, something like that. Maybe Schopenhauer, or imagine someone going, happiness is just a distraction from me solving the world's problems, something like that. So happiness isn't actually important, you might say. Or you might argue more that that choosing to study and work as a philosopher has made you less happy. So say, well, look, happiness can't be changed anyway, so it can't be possible that by working as a philosopher I've changed my happiness, because happiness can't be changed. Some people believe in that, but absolutely not a big proportion of people believe that in a strong way. And what about if only the sad philosophy students become professional philosophers? So it's a selection that way. So there's philosophy students, and some are happy and some are sad, and the happy ones go off and make real money or do other things, and the sad ones think someone's got to solve the world's problems, or someone's got to create the next advance in logic or something like that, and they say, well, and I've got nothing else to do, so I'll do that. Something like that might resolve the triad of tension. So, why might philosophy make us less happy? Well, first of all, maybe it doesn't. That's still a live possibility. Maybe we're realistic. Maybe we're just very, very onto it about the way the world is. But maybe it does make us less happy. Why might that be? Well, we choose not to focus on happiness because happiness isn't that important. We just focus on other things. We're using our great smarts to pursue other things for ourselves. Maybe the truth hurts, and philosophers are really good at getting closer to the truth. As we get closer to the truth, it hurts more. But we're addicted to truth. We've got to keep going. And that's one thing I wanted to say at the start. You can imagine, for those of you who've been in love with the wrong person, you've been in love with someone, but they hurt you. It hurts you to be with them. Certain things about them really hurt you, but you love them nonetheless. Maybe that's what it is with philosophy. Like I love the truth and I have to do it even though it makes me unhappy. I have to do that thing. Maybe we just don't have the attitudes or perform the behaviours that are conducive to happiness. And positive psychology and happiness studies, or science of happiness, has taught us quite a lot about things that do and don't make much of a difference. And here's a little summary of all the other things the philosophers were worse at. And a lot of these are positive psychologists' measures of ways to gain well-being or to gain happiness. So having positive relations with others, philosophers scored worse on. That's a very important one for your well-being. But again, maybe they're just more realistic. They realise that the coffee person isn't their friend. Personal growth. So most people hear philosophy, who aren't philosophers, they hear philosophy and they go, oh cool, so you're into you go to the spirituality section of the bookshop and you're into personal growth and those kinds of things. And we're like, no. And in actual fact, really no. So we're worse in personal growth than non-philosophers. Environmental mastery is our perception of how well we can control the world around us. And we do worse on that as well. Again, maybe just more realistic. It's a big world and there's just one of us. using our strengths. So one of the big things in positive psychology is strengths use. Identify your strengths, use your strengths as often as you can, especially your key or signature strengths or something like that. Now, philosophers, we should think that we have key or signature strengths, boring people, disrupting third parties, all those kinds of things. But philosophers don't think we use we know what our strengths are, but we just don't use them. We don't think we use them as much as normal people think they use these strengths. Maybe like, I'm a genius, but I'm stuck in this teaching job, or whatever it is. The pleasure and the meaning paths to happiness. So there's this survey of questions about the ways that you achieve happiness, and there's supposed to be like different orientations to it. And philosophers just don't do any of them. And so it's not a kind of you're this or you're that. It's like, how well do you do on the different ways? And philosophers do badly they do worse than non-philosophers on most of them, including the pleasure path and the meaning path. So you would think, well, surely philosophers, they're like, it's all about meaning, isn't it? Like, what else is there? And I think the answer is no, because philosophers realize everything's meaningless. Maybe that's part of the problem. But also, that particular, as a philosopher, reading these surveys about happiness, I see things, I'm like, that is just a stupid question for a philosopher, because we interpret things literally. So when a question says something like, would you change anything about your past? Strongly disagree to strongly agree. Well, I strongly agree because there's at least one thing I would change. Even though I'm very happy and very satisfied with how my life went, I'm sure I'd change one thing, so I strongly agree. That's not how the question is written. You're supposed to interpret it as, would you change a lot or a little bit? And they have questions like that about meaning as well, where they assume that if you're not searching for a certain kind of meaning, then you have low meaning in your life. Whereas we're just not searching because we've already done that search and we've understood that there's nothing there, and we've crossed that off and we're going on to the next thing, and we're happy where we are. So some things don't work well for philosophers. Gratitude. I'm very grateful. I really appreciate being brought out here, by the way. Thank you very much. So we don't do enough of that. And savouring the moment. How often is it that you get a whole bunch of people, half of whom are kind of paying attention to you when you're talking about your research? I've got to soak it in. And there's different ways you can soak it in, and philosophers are bad at all of those ways, again. So sensing, absorbing it, behavioural expression, which is going, yeah, this is great. It's probably the first time I've ever seen a philosopher do that. And counting blessings, like, wow, it's a bit like gratitude, that one. And finally, flow. So I'm surprised that philosophers did worse on flow, because I feel like teaching or writing a research paper, these are flow moments where you lose yourself, you get absorbed in what you're doing, and then you're like, oh, I was at the time, and I feel really good about what I achieved, having the right level of challenge and those things. So I'm surprised, but we also did worse on that. And there's a few other things that we did the same, not statistically significantly differently to normal people, particularly autonomy. So autonomy, okay, we've got something that we're at least equal at. We're actually slightly above, but it's not statistically significant. There's a difference. So maybe we're just not doing the right things. We don't have the right dispositions and the right attitudes to be happy. Maybe that's part of it. So, I don't know how much time I've got left. Doesn't matter. Okay. So just before I sum up, there's plenty of other things I'm happy to take questions on as well, like moral psychology, and I might do the experience machine as a thing to think about as well, like the philosophy version of how this would have gone. So, philosophy does seem to attract slightly less happy students for whatever reason. Maybe they're just slightly more realistic. They have a better understanding of where they're at or something like that. But then we do something to them. We change their views of how important happiness is, it seems like, if the data's anything to go by. And they get less happiness than what they might have got from doing something else. But maybe that's okay. Because what they're getting is truth or something else that maybe is a bigger part of well-being than happiness is. Maybe that's fine. So, and if you're thinking, well, that's just ridiculous, happiness is obviously way more important than truth for making your life go well, who cares about truth? So if you're thinking that, then listen to this. It's an argument that philosophers find persuasive, that I don't, but you might. I've really kind of talked it up now, but some of you will know this. Imagine there's this machine, It's a wonderful machine made by super duper neuropsychologists called the experience machine. You can connect to this machine and it will give you this wide range of experiences, mixing good and bad if you want to, but ultimately amazing experiences that you're very, very unlikely to have in your real life. So just think for yourself, what is something I would really love to do? Put loads of that in, what you would experience in the experience machine. You know when you have a cold? No colds in the experience machine. You've got the flu, no flus. Occasionally you do have a sickness or a setback, you know, just so you can really experience the glory of not being sick back, doing all those things. So you have these wonderful, wonderful experiences in the experience machine. When you connect for life. When you're in there, you have no idea that it's not real. So it could be seamless. You go to sleep tonight, you wake up tomorrow, and it seems just the same, and you don't even think. Everything's suspiciously cooler now, or more fun. You don't really think that. You still believe that 100% that it's real. Only your experiences are much better. Of course, it's a simulation. Now, do you think that someone would prefer the simulated life or the life as it is now, the real life? The point being, in the simulated life, you get the experience of happiness, like as much of that as you want, only it's not real. And what's connected to reality, or what is a more veridical experience, is presumably what we have here. But there's less pleasure or less happiness in this life in terms of what you experience. All that's supposed to say is that happiness isn't everything. That's usually how that thought experiment is used. Because if happiness was everything, you'd be like, I'm in the machine. I actually am quite in favour of the machine. But people have worries like, what about my pets? Or my children usually bring up after pets. What about pets? And you're supposed to just imagine that you didn't have those, or some people say that they can connect too, but I don't like the idea of forcing them to do this, but that's the idea. So if just in case you were thinking, are philosophers crazy? They probably still are crazy, but at least on the question of truth and happiness, it might not be as obvious as you first thought, that happiness is just way, way, way better. But if you do think that, it's fine, because I also agree with that. Okay, thanks very much.